The hospital stood at the edge of the small English coast, its white walls chipped and tired, its windows shaking each time the siren screamed in the distance, and yet inside those walls life went on quietly, like the last candle refusing to die even when the wind kept coming back again and again. Clara had been there for months, her hands always trembling from the cold even under the gloves, her uniform stiff from washing and drying too quickly near the boiler, her hair tied up so tight that sometimes she forgot it was there at all. She worked because that was all she knew how to do, one bandage at a time, one whispered comfort, one more night of pretending that the world outside still had meaning. She had seen too many faces by then, faces that arrived pale and broken, faces that left covered by a single white sheet. She had stopped crying long ago, not because she was strong but because she was tired of hearing her own sobs, but that changed one rainy evening when the ambulance truck brought in a man who should have been her enemy. He was young, not much older than her, his uniform torn and muddy, his chest wrapped in blood-soaked cloth, and the smell of iron filled the air as they lifted him from the stretcher. One of the orderlies whispered that he was a German pilot, shot down over the channel, barely alive, and that he would not last the night. Clara did not answer, she simply nodded and followed her orders. For days he lay there in the small ward where foreign soldiers were kept apart. The doctors had patched him up but said little. His breathing was shallow, his skin so pale it looked like the light itself refused to touch him. Clara tended to him in silence, cleaning his wounds, changing the bandages, always careful not to meet his eyes for too long, yet sometimes when she did, she found something there that unsettled her. Something that was not hatred, not fear, but something strange and almost human. One night, when the air outside was heavy with fog and the sound of distant artillery echoed like thunder under the sea, he spoke, his voice cracked and dry but calm, asking in a broken accent where he was. Clara hesitated, then said softly, "England, you are in England." He looked confused for a moment and then smiled weakly, the first smile she had seen in months. His name was Emile, he said, and before she could tell him not to speak, he whispered that he did not mean to crash here, that he had flown through clouds so thick he could not tell sky from ocean, and when the engine failed, he thought it was the end. Clara said nothing, she simply pressed a damp cloth against his forehead and told him to rest. The next morning she found a small piece of paper under his water cup. It was torn from an old medical log, and in shaky handwriting were the words "thank you." She wanted to ignore it but she could not, so later that night she wrote back on the same paper, only one word, "Why," and left it on his tray. When she came back the following evening, his reply was waiting, "Because you looked at me as if I was not a monster." From that moment the letters began, short at first, hidden under cups, inside folded bandages, behind the loose brick near the heater, small notes exchanged between two people who were never meant to speak. She would ask about his life, his family, his home. He would tell her about the lake behind his village, how he used to fish with his younger brother before the war, how the air there smelled of pine and rain. And sometimes he would ask her about London, about her parents, about what she missed the most. She never told him much, only that she used to read by candlelight and that her mother made tea with too much sugar, but somehow that was enough. The letters became their quiet world, a place untouched by orders or flags or the sound of guns, each word a fragile bridge built in secret between two hearts that should have remained apart. But one evening the matron nearly caught her. The sound of footsteps made Clara's heart race as she slipped the paper under her sleeve and smiled as if nothing was wrong. That night she could not sleep. She kept thinking of what would happen if anyone found out, how easily everything could disappear. Weeks passed and Emile began to walk again, slowly at first, leaning on a cane, his smile growing stronger each day, and sometimes when she entered the ward she found him reading, humming softly to himself, and it made something warm stir in her chest, something dangerous and gentle at the same time. But the war did not stop for love, it never did. One evening he gave her a letter longer than usual, folded carefully and tied with a piece of string. She took it without reading until later that night, under the dim lamp near her cot. His handwriting was uneven but full of life. He wrote about the sound of rain on the window, about the birds that landed near his window sill, about how he had never imagined being grateful for the enemy's kindness, and at the end, he wrote something that made her stop breathing for a moment. He wrote, "If the world was different, I would have met you by the lake, not here, not like this." Clara pressed the paper to her chest and sat there for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the hospital generator and the faint echoes of sirens in the distance, she knew then that something had changed, and no matter how much she tried to deny it, she had begun to care. Days turned into weeks, the war outside shifting and roaring beyond their walls, but inside that small ward the air felt still, as if time had slowed down for them alone, and then one morning the officers arrived. They said Emil was to be transferred, prisoner exchange, they said, back to Germany, to wherever men like him belonged. Clara stood there as they took him away, his eyes meeting hers for one brief second, the kind of look that said everything words could not, and then he was gone, just like that, the bed empty, the silence unbearable. For nights she could not sleep, she kept rereading his letters until the edges tore, and then, one cold dawn, she wrote one last letter though she had no address to send it to. She wrote, "I hope you made it home, I hope you are alive, I hope you still think of the lake sometimes." She folded it and placed it inside her uniform pocket, near her heart, and kept it there like a secret prayer. Months later, long after the war began to tilt toward its uncertain end, a package arrived for her, no name, no return address, just a simple envelope inside, aged and wrinkled from travel. Inside was a small letter written in familiar handwriting. It said, "I am alive, the war is ending, I will write again when there is peace, until then keep your light." And signed, simply, Emil. The war ended not with cheers but with an ache that settled in the bones of the country, like rain that never stopped falling. The guns quieted, the planes vanished, and yet the silence felt louder than the bombs ever had. It pressed against every wall and every heart, reminding them that even peace could be cruel. Clara walked through the empty corridors of the hospital one last time, the ward stripped bare, the beds empty, the smell of antiseptic fading into dust. She had stayed through it all, through the sirens, through the long nights, through the endless faces that came and went, and now there was nothing left to do but go home, whatever home meant after everything. She carried her small suitcase and a bundle of folded letters tied with a thin ribbon, the ones she could never throw away, some written in her hand, some in his, each one carrying pieces of time that no one else would ever understand. When the train left the station she sat by the window, watching the land roll by, fields turning to ruins and ruins turning to silence, wondering if somewhere across the sea, he was looking at the same horizon. London was scarred but breathing again, people smiled as if learning how to live all over, the smell of smoke still lingered, the buildings still stood like ghosts, but life was beginning to grow between the cracks. Clara rented a small flat near the river, found work in a clinic that treated returning soldiers, men with trembling hands and hollow eyes. She treated them gently, as if each face might be his, though she knew it wasn't. They said Emil was to be transferred, prisoner exchange, they said, back to Germany, to wherever men like him belonged. Clara stood there as they took him away, his eyes meeting hers for one brief second, the kind of look that said everything words could not, and then he was gone, just like that, the bed empty, the silence unbearable. For nights she could not sleep, she kept rereading his letters until the edges tore, and then, one cold dawn, she wrote one last letter though she had no address to send it to. She wrote, "I hope you made it home, I hope you are alive, I hope you still think of the lake sometimes." She folded it and placed it inside her uniform pocket, near her heart, and kept it there like a secret prayer. Months later, long after the war began to tilt toward its uncertain end, a package arrived for her, no name, no return address, just a simple envelope inside, aged and wrinkled from travel. Inside was a small letter written in familiar handwriting. It said, "I am alive, the war is ending, I will write again when there is peace, until then keep your light." And signed, simply, Emil. The war ended not with cheers but with an ache that settled in the bones of the country, like rain that never stopped falling. The guns quieted, the planes vanished, and yet the silence felt louder than the bombs ever had. It pressed against every wall and every heart, reminding them that even peace could be cruel. Clara walked through the empty corridors of the hospital one last time, the ward stripped bare, the beds empty, the smell of antiseptic fading into dust. She had stayed through it all, through the sirens, through the long nights, through the endless faces that came and went, and now there was nothing left to do but go home, whatever home meant after everything. She carried her small suitcase and a bundle of folded letters tied with a thin ribbon, the ones she could never throw away, some written in her hand, some in his, each one carrying pieces of time that no one else would ever understand. When the train left the station she sat by the window, watching the land roll by, fields turning to ruins and ruins turning to silence, wondering if somewhere across the sea, he was looking at the same horizon. London was scarred but breathing again, people smiled as if learning how to live all over, the smell of smoke still lingered, the buildings still stood like ghosts, but life was beginning to grow between the cracks. Clara rented a small flat near the river, found work in a clinic that treated returning soldiers, men with trembling hands and hollow eyes. She treated them gently, as if each face might be his, though she knew it wasn't. At night she would take out the letters, spreading them across her table like pieces of another life, and she would read the last one again and again. I will write again when there is peace, he had promised, but peace had come and gone and still no letter. Perhaps he had forgotten, perhaps he had not survived, perhaps the world had decided that love like theirs did not deserve to exist. Weeks turned into months, and then into years, and still she waited, her hair growing shorter, her uniform replaced by plain dresses, her hands still careful and her heart still too soft, and sometimes when the wind came from the east she would close her eyes and imagine it had crossed the sea carrying his voice with it. One evening in late autumn, when the air smelled of rain and coal smoke, she found herself walking by the docks. She didn't know why she went there, maybe because she couldn't sleep, maybe because she wanted to stand where the sea began and feel the weight of everything she had lost. The tide was low and the sound of the water against the stones was slow and sad, and then she saw him. At first she thought her mind was playing tricks, a tall figure standing near the edge, coat blowing in the wind, face turned toward the gray horizon, but then he turned and she knew, before her mind could catch up her heart already had, Emile, alive, older, thinner, but real as the night they had said goodbye. She froze, unable to move or speak, the years between them collapsing like paper walls, and then he smiled, the same quiet smile that had once been her only light. She walked toward him slowly, afraid that if she moved too quickly he might vanish, but he didn't. He waited, his hands trembling slightly, eyes glistening with something deeper than words. "You're here," she whispered, her voice barely holding. "I didn't think," and he stopped her gently. "I know," he said, "I tried to find you. It took so long, everything was broken, letters lost, names changed, they watched us, they watched everyone. I had to wait until I was sure, until I could come back without chains." He handed her an envelope, worn and yellow, sealed but never sent. "I wrote every year," he said, "but I never knew where to send them. They would have destroyed them anyway. They called me a traitor once they found your first letter. They burned everything, almost everything, but I kept this one, hoping someday you'd see it." Clara took it in shaking hands, opened it slowly, the paper brittle with time, the words blurred slightly by smudged ink. It was simple, only a few lines, but enough to make the world around her blur into tears. "If peace ever comes, I will find you by the water, because the lake and the sea are the same in the end, both endless, both patient, both forgiving." She couldn't speak, the weight of the years pressed too hard against her chest, so she did the only thing she could. She reached out and touched his face, feeling the warmth of life beneath her fingertips, something she had dreamed of for too long. He closed his eyes and for a moment neither of them said a word, the sound of the waves filling the silence they didn't need to break. They walked along the dock until the lamps began to fade into mist, talking quietly, like old friends who had simply lost their way back to each other. He told her of the years after the war, of rebuilding his village, of how his brother never came home, of how he had stood by the lake every spring waiting for the ice to melt, always wondering if she was alive. She told him of the hospital, of the endless faces, of the night she found his last letter, of how she had never stopped believing he would keep his promise. They laughed softly at small things, the way he mispronounced her name after all this time, the way she still carried her tea too hot. And though the world around them had changed, in that moment it didn't matter. They were two souls who had survived everything the world tried to destroy. When the rain began, they took shelter in a small cafe near the harbor, sitting by the window with steaming cups between them, the candlelight flickering across their faces, and for a brief moment, it felt as if they were young again, as if the war had never stolen anything, as if time had only paused to let them begin again. As the night deepened, Emile looked out toward the sea and said quietly, "I used to think war was only about sides, about flags and orders, but it's not. It's about people, about what you lose when you stop seeing faces. I learned that from you, Clara, from the way you looked at me when I was supposed to be your enemy." She smiled through tears, and replied softly, "Maybe we were never enemies at all, maybe the world just told us we were." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers, and they sat there in silence, the candle burning low, the sound of rain against the glass steady and calm, the kind of quiet that only comes after too many storms. Before they parted that night, he asked where she lived, and she wrote the address on a small napkin, folding it into his palm. "Come by tomorrow," she said, "we have time now," and for the first time in years she truly believed it. When she reached home she placed his letter on the table, smoothing the paper gently, then opened the window and let the wind in. The air smelled of rain and salt, and somewhere in the distance, the sea whispered like an old song. The next morning she woke early, brewed tea, and set 2 cups on the table. The clock ticked softly, hours passing in warm silence, and then a knock at the door. She opened it to find Emile standing there, a small smile on his face, his coat damp from the rain, a small envelope in his hand. He handed it to her and said, "This time I'll give it to you myself." Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in his familiar uneven handwriting, the words simple but steady. "Dear Clara, this is not a letter from war, this is a letter from peace, from a man who never forgot the light that reached him when the world was dark, from a man who learned that sometimes the heart knows no borders, no uniforms, only truth." She looked up at him, and the tears came again, not from pain but from something deeper, something like release. He stepped inside, closed the doors softly behind him, and the world outside faded into the quiet hum of life continuing. The years that followed were quiet but full. They lived simply near the coast, where the sea met the sky in soft gray tones. Sometimes they spoke of the past, sometimes they didn't, sometimes they just sat by the window, letting the light fall across their faces, content in the silence they had earned. And though the world never knew their story, though no book or monument would ever carry their names, their letters remained, hidden in a small wooden box, each one a testament to the strange and stubborn beauty of 2 hearts that refused to hate. Years slipped by like pages turning slowly in the wind, and the world moved forward without waiting for anyone to catch up. Cities rebuilt, children were born who never knew the sound of sirens, and the scars of war faded into stories told quietly at dinner tables by voices that grew older each year. Clara and Emile built a life that was simple but full. They lived near the sea where the gulls cried in the morning and the horizon stretched endlessly. Their small cottage stood at the edge of the cliffs, whitewashed walls and a garden that smelled of rosemary and salt, the kind of place where time felt softer, kinder, slower, and each morning Emile would brew tea just the way she liked it, with too much sugar, because that was how she had once said her mother made it, and each evening they would walk down to the shore, the waves touching their feet like gentle memories returning again and again. They did not speak much about the past, not because it hurt but because they no longer needed to. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer heavy with what was lost but calm with what had been found. Sometimes they would sit by the window as rain tapped against the glass, and Clara would trace her finger across the letters they had kept, hundreds of them now, tied with ribbons of faded color, each one a heartbeat captured in ink. The letters became their ritual, their anchor. Every year on the anniversary of the day they met, they would each write a new one, not because they had anything new to say but because the act itself was sacred. It reminded them that love could outlive anything, even war, even silence, even time itself. They would write about small things, the smell of bread baking in the morning, the sound of church bells from the village below, the way the sunlight made the sea shimmer like glass, and then they would seal the letters and place them in a wooden box Emile had built with his own hands, carved with their initials and a small symbol of the lake, their lake. As the years went by, Emile's hair turned silver, Clara's hands grew slower, and yet they still walked the same path every evening, still held hands as if afraid to let go. The world outside grew louder, faster, new wars began far away, new faces appeared on newspapers, but none of it touched them. Their world remained quiet, untouched, and that was enough. One winter morning the air was sharp and the waves restless. Clara woke early to find Emile sitting by the window, a blanket over his shoulders, his gaze fixed on the horizon. She smiled and said softly that he would catch a chill if he stayed there too long. He turned to her with that same small smile, the one that had never changed, and said, "Do you remember the first time you looked at me? I thought you hated me." She laughed quietly, shaking her head, and replied, "I was terrified, you were supposed to be the enemy." He smiled again and whispered, "And yet you weren't." That night the wind howled and the storm rolled in from the sea, and Clara woke to the sound of it roaring against the windows. She reached for him, but the space beside her was still and cold. He was gone, not violently, not painfully, just quietly, as if he had decided that his heart had said everything it needed to say. And when she found him, he was still sitting by the window, eyes open toward the dawn that was just beginning to break. And in his lap was a letter, sealed, with her name written carefully across it. Her hands trembled as she opened it, the ink uneven, the paper slightly smudged, but the words clear and steady. "My dear Clara, if you are reading this, it means I have gone before you. Do not be sad. I have lived a life I never thought possible, because of you. Because once you looked at a stranger and saw a man instead of an enemy, you gave me peace in a world that had forgotten what that word meant. Keep our letters safe. Keep them where the sea can hear them, because someday someone will find them, and they will know that even in the darkest time, love existed, and it survived." Clara read the letter until the candle burned low and the storm began to fade, and then she placed it inside the wooden box with all the others, tied the ribbon once more, and closed the lid gently. She sat by the window until the first light touched the sea, and whispered, "You kept your promise, my love, you found me by the water." The years after Emil's passing were soft and slow. Clara grew older, her hair turned white, her step smaller, but she never left the cottage. She tended to the garden, wrote letters she no longer sent, and sometimes talked to him as if he were still there. She lived quietly, peacefully, until one spring morning when the neighbors found the door open and the kettle still warm. She was gone too, her body resting in the chair by the window, a faint smile on her lips, the sea calm and shining beyond the glass. When the house was emptied years later, long after both their names had faded from memory, a young woman arrived from London, a historian collecting letters and diaries from the war. She was Clara's granddaughter. Though she had never met her, she had grown up hearing only fragments, stories about a nurse who once saved a German soldier and vanished to live by the sea. And as she walked through the small room she felt something quiet in the air, something like love that had never left. In the attic she found the box, old and covered in dust. She brushed it clean and lifted the lid, and inside were hundreds of letters, tied with ribbons, each one dated, each one a conversation between two souls who had refused to let the world decide who they should be. She sat on the floor, tears running down her face as she read the first one, the words trembling in her hands. "Thank you, because you looked at me as if I was not a monster." She read for hours, letter after letter, the voices of Clara and Emil echoing softly in her mind, their words painting the world they had built, their fears, their hopes, their laughter, and she realized that this was not just a story of war and love, it was a story of defiance, of seeing humanity when no one else could, of finding light when everything else was darkness. When the sun began to set, she carried the box to the shore, the same shore where Clara and Emil had walked all those years ago, the wind gentle, the waves whispering softly, and she opened one of the letters and read aloud to the sea, her voice trembling but clear, as if returning the words to where they had always belonged. Later, she donated the letters to a small museum in the city, under a single title written in delicate script, "Letters to the Enemy," and below it, a small note in her handwriting, a reminder that love is not bound by borders or time. People came and read them, some cried, some smiled, some simply stood in silence, and somewhere beyond the edges of time, perhaps in a place where the lake meets the sea, two souls sat together watching the world remember them, and smiled. Because in the end their story had not been forgotten, it had only been waiting to be found, waiting for the right hands to open the box, to let the words breathe again, to let the love that survived a war become something larger than both of them, something eternal. And so the letters remained, not just as ink on paper, but as proof that even in the darkest hours of history, two hearts could find each other, could write to each other, could forgive, could love, could live. And somewhere, on quiet nights when the tide is low and the stars are clear, if you stand by the sea and listen closely, you might still hear the faint whisper of a voice saying, "If the world was different, I would have met you by the lake, not here, not like this," and another voice, softer but sure, replying, "The world became different because we met." The sea carries their words still, the endless echo of what they once were, what they still are, a promise written not in ink but in eternity, and that is how the story ends, not with goodbye, but with the gentle murmur of waves beneath an endless sky. Because love, even born in war, does not die, it only changes form, becoming the light that stays.